So next up, we have Dave Moore and Rebecca Siegle. Let me give Dave, talking about the results of 17 years of monitoring at the Los Lunas habitat restoration site.
So yeah, Becky and I are going to give you the details on some of the monitoring that we've done over the past 17 years at the Los Lunas habitat restoration site. I guess by means of introduction, I'm Dave Moore. I'm a biologist with the Bureau of Reclamation's Technical Service Center in Denver. And Becky is with us as well.
Yes, I am also with the TSC as a biologist. As Dave said, Reclamation has monitored the Los Lunas restoration site for 17 years, beginning in 2003 and through 2019. The slide you see here, or the pictures you see here, are taken from one of our photo stations at the center of the site, and that's near a ponded area.
Yeah.
The site's located just south, oops.
No, go ahead, Becky.
I'm done with that side, you can go.
Okay, well good. I was gonna say, we're gonna try to keep this as free-flowing as possible and unawkward, given the technical difficulties we've already experienced.
So the site is located southeast of the town of Los Lunas, or city really, of Los Lunas, which is south of Albuquerque.
Slow down.
It's a 119-acre site, and it's bounded by the river on the east side and the Levee Road on the west. So the site burned in 2000, which provided a great opportunity for active restoration. The Los Lunas restoration site was the first site selected to meet Fish and Wildlife Service requirements. The service mandated that habitat restoration within 8 reaches along the Middle Rio Grande, in accordance with a biological opinion from June 2001. The primary objectives of the site were to improve habitat for the silvery minnow and southwestern willow flycatcher. The western yellow-billed cuckoo was listed in 2014, so that was not one of the initial objectives of the site, but currently it is one of our goals to create habitat, breeding habitat for the cuckoo. Next, Dave.
Next.
So the area that was designated as a restoration site is basically divided east and west by a root rod berm. The Corps and Reclamation are the joint leads on this project, and the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District is our non-federal cooperator. So our restoration work began in 2002. The photo you see here is of where active restoration took place, and that's adjacent to the river on the east side of the project area and of the root rod berm that I mentioned. To the west of the berm is an area we call the burned area, and that's no construction took place there, but we did have some plantings. The site was designed to flood when flows were greater than 2,500 CFS. The site was excavated and the floodplain was lowered to create overbank flooding, to allow overbank flooding in the site. And also there was a network of side channels incorporated to provide silvery minnow habitat. A requirement at the site was that it be monitored for 15 years. And Reclamation began Avian, Vegetation, Groundwater Monitoring in 2003.
Okay, so being that Becky's our resident botanist and I've been more on the bird side of things, I'm going to take over and talk a little bit about some of the bird monitoring we've done in the site. So as Becky mentioned, we've been conducting avian point counts within the site since basically 2003. And within each kind of treatment portion of the site, the cleared / overbank area and the burned area, we established 12 points. These were 50-meter radius point counts that we conducted 3 times a year between basically mid-May and about the 1st of July or mid-July. We established these points, as I mentioned, within each of the cleared overbank areas and the burned areas. As Becky mentioned, the cleared overbank area is exactly what it sounds. It was an area that was burned and subsequently cleared, had some high flow channels installed to hopefully provide some silvery minnow habitat. And that area we did survey every year between 2003 and 2019. The burned area we surveyed almost every year as well, although there were a couple years where we tried to substitute another representative site, and it just didn't seem like the best plan. So we went back to conducting our point counts actually in the burned area as well. By means of results, and I know these charts are pretty busy, but what you see here is on the top, and I need to get my little pointer going here. On the top, you've got a representation of the data collected in the cleared overbank area. On the bottom, this is data collected within the burned area. And these two charts represent relative abundance as far as mean number of birds per point and species richness, which is total number of species recorded. These are divvied up by year, and the bird species are divvied into basically nesting habitat guilds or habitat use guilds. So along the bottom, if you can see, we've got canopy, cavity, nesters, dense shrub, edge, ground shrub, mid-story, open habitat users, and water birds. And so, as you would expect in the cleared area, initially we were recording a whole bunch of water birds because, as you know, as mentioned, there were high flow channels installed, so there was a fair amount of overbanking, thankfully, that occurred, which is exactly as the project was designed. So we were recording a whole bunch of water birds, not a whole lot of tree using or, you know, riparian habitat using species there. It had been cleared. Then as you see over time, we start picking up, you know, more of the mid-story and canopy using species. The mid-story is this kind of dark green here. Basically the willow flycatcher. That's the guild that the flycatcher would be in. So as far as creating habitat for flycatchers, it's looking good here. Similarly, when you look at the species richness numbers, we again start seeing more of those mid-story species as that habitat type develops. You know, obviously early on, lots of water birds. But then as more riparian habitat develops, you start seeing those mid-story species. When we look down here at the burned area, being that it wasn't a charred moonscape. There, you know, as most fires do, it hit certain areas hard and left certain areas, you know, less impacted. So there's not a whole lot of change as far as, you know, our relative abundance. I mean, things fluctuated a little bit on an annual basis, but no real trends. The mid-story birds were still represented. We still had a decent ground shrub component. Not a whole lot to say about, you know, the burned area as far as relative abundance of the species guilds. Within the burned area, species richness, again, more or less unchanged over time, which again is kind of what you would expect. As the habitat filled back in after, you know, several years post-fire, we did see kind of an average increase in the number of species, but not a great amount of a trend as far as the guilds that were using that area. And, you know, to be expected, when we conducted a linear regression of mid-story birds, which is again what would contain our willow flycatcher, which is one of the species that this restoration site was geared towards, we saw a pretty strong relationship, you know, very significant as far as the regression line goes, of an increasing trend in our mid-story usage by mid-story birds. Sorry, my face is right up against the camera. When we talk about multidimensional scaling ordination, which is, kind of taking into effect all of the birds recorded within the burned area and the cleared overbank area, there's been a lot of movement within the cleared overbank area. Back here in 2003, you track this along and things are progressing pretty quickly as habitat develops. When we looked at the burned area, again, not a whole lot of change as far as the birds that were using that burned area. But obviously over time, the burned or the cleared area more or less started to match with what we found in the burned area. As both of those habitats, while as the one came in and the other one kind of recovered, they somewhat tended to merge as far as the bird species that were using those areas. So again, pretty similar to the last charts that I showed you. We have also been conducting flycatcher surveys within this Belen Reach for many, many years. I think we began surveying for flycatchers in the Belen Reach in 2004. And more recently, as Becky mentioned, the cuckoo came on the scene. It was listed in 2014. And so we began doing surveys adjacent to the Los Lunas restoration site for cuckoos several years ago as well. The maps that you see here, the red and yellow and green, are based on our Hinkenhomart mapping and our habitat suitability modeling. So the red is unsuitable habitat for flycatchers on the left and cuckoos on the right. And as you can see, there's not a whole lot of suitable habitat within this reach for either species. However, we do have some moderately suitable habitat for flycatchers within the Los Lunas restoration site. And we do have some suitable habitat for cuckoos within the Los Lunas restoration site. And this is as of 2016, which again is 4 years ago. We were gonna map habitat again last year, but COVID kicked our butts. So we weren't able to get out there and do our mapping. We are gonna do another round of mapping this coming summer. But in terms of survey results, we have never located a resident flycatcher or cuckoo within the Los Lunas restoration site. Unfortunately, that's the downside. We have recorded several migrant flycatchers over the years within the site. As I mentioned, it does contain some moderately suitable habitat for flycatchers, and it's looking pretty good as far as restoration, the overall restoration goals go. But we haven't had any breeding birds in the site. Similarly with cuckoos, we recorded cuckoos within the vicinity. There's a couple detections a couple kilometers north. There's a couple detections a few kilometers south, but no resident birds within the Los Lunas site either. Becky.
Yes. Next slide, please.
I think I did. Can you not see it? There's some sort of lag going on. Can you see it now?
There we go. Yep.
Okay.
So with regards to vegetation monitoring, we established 12 permanent vegetation transects in that cleared area adjacent to the river, and those were monitored for the full study period from 2003 to 2019. So those are those are the green transects in the map there. And along those, we monitored understory cover and species composition, and we also measured overstory cover, species composition, and height. Next bullet, Dave, please.
Yep.
We conducted another brief study from 2005 to 2006, looking at survivorship of potted plants and cottonwood poles. Most of the survivorship plots or transects were in the burned area or along the berm there. And the cottonwood pole plots, which are the purple ones, were along the levee road. Next.
Yep.
So our results here are for our understory. The black line you see in the graph shows total cover, and the columns represent proportion of life forms that we found or detected each year. The plant cover in the understory was significantly higher from 2004 to 2010 than in any of the other years, and that's that's not surprising. You know, we had a higher understory cover before we really had an overstory layer develop. So it went down once we had more overstory, less sun. As you can see, the native grasses and native forbs were our dominant life forms. Those are in the light green and the red. So those were dominant throughout the study. Okay, next. Species richness. The green line there shows how many species were detected on an annual basis. In all, over the entire study period, we detected 82 plant species, and that's including both understory and overstory. You can see the blue line there represents native species. So native species remain dominant throughout in both understory and overstory. Next. As far as overstory vegetation, again, the black line represents our total cover. We did not begin monitoring overstory as a separate layer until 2007. That's kind of around the time we started seeing it develop more. We considered understory all herbaceous species and grasses and our woody species under 1 meter. So once we started to get developed stand over 1 meter of woody species, then we started measuring our overstory. The cover significantly increased since 2007 when we started monitoring it. Throughout the study, cottonwood and coyote willow were our dominant species based on cover, cottonwood being the red there, and coyote willow the lighter green. As far as frequency of detection, you can see that cottonwood, coyote willow, and salt cedar near the top there have been detected in most of our plots since the start of the study. What really stands out here is Russian olive, that kind of gold-orange color. In the beginning, only 17% of our plots did we detect Russian olive in. And by 2016, we detected Russian olive in 100% of our plots. And that's pretty much remained 100% since 2016. One thing I wanted to mention on the vegetation cover, if you look at the 2019 column there, the community has developed into cottonwood and Russian olive over salt cedar and coyote willow community. Okay. This is another one of those busy graphs that you saw with the Avian study. This is just showing us how our vegetation community has changed over time and what the similarity of the community has been. From 2003 till about 2010, you can see that the community was quite different as compared to the later years of the study. In fact, our highest similarities were between about 2013 to 2019. The overlay circles you see associated with each year gives you an idea of what our cover was of the 4 most dominant overstory species. The salt cedar has increased less than any of the other species. You can see salt cedar is the pink one, right? Yeah, the pink one. And that really, by the time we get to 2019, really hasn't changed that much. What's really increased in cover is the cottonwood. We kind of started out with hardly any back from 2003 to 2007, and then by 2019, it's pretty much the dominant species. The second graph here shows us the height of species. No surprises here. Cottonwood has grown to about greater than 10 meters. It's our tallest species, followed by Russian olive, and our understory of salt cedar and coyote willow at the bottom there has remained below about 4 meters. Next. So we're going to take a little photo tour here through the site, and this is what vegetation looked like in 2019. That middle photo is a good example of our most common species that we find there. We have cottonwood there in the background with a coyote willow understory, and then we have some Russian olive and salt cedar there on the left side. That left photo is kind of our typical cottonwood stand. You can see it's not real mature, and that's not to say there are not larger cottonwoods throughout the site, but this is pretty typical. Unfortunately, it's not really conducive to swiftfowl habitat, but does have potential to develop into cuckoo habitat. On the right photo there, you see a nice mix of some native species. That's Gooding's willow and cottonwood there on the right, with an understory of coyote willow. We have a spattering of salt cedar in there, which is pretty typical. Okay, next.
Did it come in?
No, I'm not seeing it.
No. Well, it shows on my screen.
There we go. There it is. On the left side photo, this is just kind of a nice example of some really dense coyote willow. We have plenty of patches of dense coyote willow, but they're pretty small. This, again, is not really Swiffle habitat, but because it's too short, but it could grow into and develop into some better Swiffle habitat. The middle photo I put in here because it kind of shows us the diversity we had at this site. This is narrowleaf cottonwood, which is not real common along the Middle Rio Grande. In all, we detected 8 woody species at the site. So on the right is a photo of some cages around some of our plantings. This is Gooding's willow. We also had it around some of the cottonwood poles. I put this in here just to point out some maintenance issues that you might want to consider. So about 5 or 6 years ago, we were noticing that the true willow and cottonwood were beginning to get girdled by these cages. So we sent some techs out to cut off the cages. Unfortunately, they were left on site. So it posed kind of a problem as we're traipsing through the site. We were constantly tripping over these cages because you can't really see them. So eventually we did get them off site, but it's just something to consider in restoration, is that you might want to make a plan for removing those cages once the vegetation grows. Okay, next.
Mm-hmm. I promise I did
it. There we go. The other study we did, as I said, was real brief. It was only from 2005 to 2006, but we looked at survivorship of plantings. And of the potted mixed shrubs, we had 10 transects right on the east side of the burned area. And we had 160 plants that we counted, stems we counted in 2005. And of those, 54% survived into 2006. Our most successful plants were New Mexico olive and Gooding's willow. And the photo on the right here shows what the Gooding's willow plantings developed into. It's a nice stand of willow and cottonwood there. And those were right along the berm. As far as cottonwood pole survivorship, only 38% survived out of 47 poles that we counted. Most successful were root sprouts, which basically the pole died back and then we had growth coming from the ground that developed. I think we had one pole that actually had foliage on it throughout. On the bottom photo, you can see a nice stand of cottonwood there. That's along the levee road. So even though, you know, despite a high mortality rate, we actually had a nice stand of cottonwood developed there. Next.
My turn.
Oh, that's you, Dave.
Yep. Okay, so shifting gears, although staying within kind of a vegetation monitoring aspect. One of the ways that we decided to monitor this site in terms of kind of more geared towards flycatcher habitat was to deploy some vegetation quantification plots. And we initially established this methodology back in the early 2000s as a means of quantifying occupied flycatcher habitat. Back between 2004 and 2006, we established these plots at 112 flycatcher nest sites, kind of scattered within our study area. Most of them were down in the delta of Elfin Butte Reservoir, but we had sites within the Bosque del Apache and up on the Cebieta and in various places. And we established plots and collected pretty meticulous data, and pretty tedious data, honestly. I mean, it would take us a day to get through a couple of these plots. So we recorded a lot of data. Some of it was more useful than others. And then 2015, 2016 established several similar plots within the Los Lunas restoration site in order to compare this site as far as quality of flycatcher habitat to occupied habitat that was quantified, you know, decades before, well, not decades before, 15 years before, 10 years before. So obviously this is a very busy table, I understand, but the gist of it is this first column. Well, I guess backing up, what I should mention is we quantified 112 nest sites. That's what this column represents. And we got cover values within different height intervals. We got stem densities. We recorded tree stem densities by size, class, and species composition. And then we recorded some average tree heights, percent dead trees, that kind of thing. We parsed them down into more of a selected subsample, I guess you'd say. The habitat that we quantified in Elephant Butte was as good as it gets. I mean, it was a monotypic stand of native willows, just absolutely beautiful stuff. And we realized that there's not a whole lot of that within the Rio Grande Basin. Moreover, it's kind of unrealistic to expect that kind of habitat to develop in too many areas. So we pared it down to sites that were a little more similar to Los Lunas as far as species composition and hydrology and that kind of thing. So that yielded a sample of 22 nest sites that we also compared to our sites within Los Lunas. And I'm hoping you can see these colors on these two columns to the far right. The blue coloration means that the sites within Los Lunas, either in the burned area or the cleared area, met all of the, well, not all, met the original reference site criteria. The red means it met the pared down selected sites criteria, and the green means it met both. So within the cleared overbank area, as you can see, a lot of these criteria met the standards that were established within either the reference sites or kind of our selected sites. The burned area, not quite so much. You know, as you can see here, 37% of original reference sites and 37% of selected reference sites were met by data collected within the cleared overbank area. And a little bit smaller number within the burned area met original reference site criteria. Although when we pared those data down, obviously a greater percentage. So I guess bottom line, the Los Lunas site within both the cleared area and the burn area are starting to look pretty good for flycatchers. You know, we could get into the weeds as deeply as we wanted to, looking at individual, you know, values over here. But for now, I guess the take home is it's starting to look pretty good for flycatchers. Becky? It'll show up, I promise.
So we also conducted groundwater monitoring at the site. We installed 9 shallow groundwater wells, and they're kind of along transects. They're the blue points there in the map. So we've had kind of a transect along the north, the middle, and the south portions of the site.
Sorry, slacking. Oh.
Yep, it'll come. The depths averaged about 5 feet, which isn't really deep, but it was deep enough to capture groundwater depths. We typically were able to measure groundwater within that 5 feet. In 2011, we installed hobo loggers. Prior to that, we were manually collecting data on a monthly basis by what we called the Plunker method, which wasn't really the most high-tech. What it was is we tied a little weight to the end of a measuring tape and dropped it into the well. And when we heard a kerplunk, we knew we hit water. Or if it was dry, we knew that, you know, if it hit the bottom, we knew it was dry. That, of course, did not really give us great data on frequency and duration of groundwater levels. So we've gotten better data since 2011. Here's some hydrographs of the middle well in each of the 3 north, middle, and south transects. One thing that stands out is the flows, which are shown in red, correlate really well with groundwater levels, which indicates that we have connectivity between groundwater and the flows. This is from 2019. So that was an exceptional water year, but the trends are pretty consistent from what we found every year. Our groundwater was shallowest in the north end and was deepest in the north end and shallowest in the mid area. And that's where that ponded area was in those first photos that you saw. Our south wells were more variable. This graph shows us how our flows, which in this case I'm using as a representation of groundwater since they're so correlated, how the groundwater correlated with our veg, how it tracked with the veg. The light green is our understory, and you can see they follow very closely together. That would be as expected. Our understory species are more shallow rooted, so are more dependent on that shallow groundwater. The darker green shows us an overstory, and that started in 2007, and that has continued to increase. You see somewhere around 2011, the overstory continues to increase while that was during the drought period from 2011 to about 2015. The water levels are going down, but our overstory continues to increase. And so we assume around 2011, the overstory started to have a developed enough root system that it continued to grow despite the fluctuating water table. Oh, I wanted to point out too that you can see in 2005 and 2008, we have some peaks, meaning we had really favorable hydrologic conditions early on in the study. And I think that helped in development of vegetation. We really saw overstory come on in 2006 after it had been flooded in 2005. And again, tracking wise, you see that the plant cover got higher in those years too. Dave, could you go back to that map? I forgot to mention that the photo stations were on there too.
Yep.
That one. The red here, photo stations, is basically we had stations running along the root wad berm facing towards the river into the cleared area. And then we had a line of photo stations along the levee road that faced into the burn area, facing towards the river. Thanks.
Yep.
So this is an example of one of our photo stations. It's on the root wad berm on the north section of the site. And this is facing towards the river. 2003, obviously is very cleared out. You see that cottonwood there. We had some surviving cottonwoods. Since 2003, most of those have fallen. They did provide snags for a while, but most of them are down now. We also had lots of sunflower early on in the sites were just thick with it. 2008, that's kind of after that era flooded. In 2005, like I said, the overstory species really started coming on. So you can see a lot of cottonwood in that photo. 2014 is kind of looking really nice. We have a developed understory. That's a Goodings willow right in front of us there. Nice mix of species. By 2019, we still have a developed stand. You can see more salt cedar there though, and some die off in our understory. Okay.
Okay, so in conclusion, as we hopefully have shown you, we have got a really nice bird population occupying the site. You know, as the cleared area came in, obviously those associated guilds that are using more of that, you know, taller canopy and mid-story species have come in. The mid-story guild in particular is probably the most highly represented, which would encompass willow flycatchers and theoretically yellow-billed cuckoos. The cuckoo does tend to, well, they will use, you know, taller trees, a taller canopy than the flycatcher will. But they can certainly use that lower stature stuff, you know, the stuff that's in the 5 to 8 meter tall range. They're not typically up in the real tall cottonwoods. They're down kind of in that mid-story as well. Unfortunately, we haven't recorded resident flycatchers or cuckoos within the site after multiple years of surveys for both. As we mentioned, there are detections within proximity. I guess the one thing I didn't, thinking back now, I didn't mention was that we've got nesting flycatchers just a couple kilometers north of that site on the same side of the river. So that does tend to bode well for, the flycatcher doesn't really make these long distance movements. Typically, usually it's a little bit of a leapfrog type situation. So you never know what happens moving forward. But bird-wise, things are looking pretty good.
As far as the trends we see in vegetation, there's been a development of a diverse plant community where native riparian species are dominant. We also did find in the understory some wetland albagood species, which is a good sign. I forgot to mention that everything in that cleared area naturally regenerated. We did not do any seeding there. So everything that came up was from the seed source on site. And we really had long-term success at that site, naturally established veg. Also, the plantings did appear to be successful based on monitoring and observation. Unfortunate trend we see is a spread of invasive Russian olive. The Berlin Reach has a lot of Russian olive and it is pretty abundant, and so the seed source is there, unfortunately. We've also had limited development of variables in the vegetation that are conducive to breeding habitat for the swiffle, but we do see a lot of potential to provide occupied cuckoo breeding habitat. Trends we see in groundwater are that water table levels are closely linked to river flows, indicating connectivity, which is a good sign of healthy hydrologic conditions. Groundwater is shallow enough to support the recruitment and establishment of riparian native species as well. They've endured. Next. So we see a value in continued monitoring at this site. Requirements of the BO were met in 2017. The Corps was gracious enough to fund us for 2 more years, so we have data through 2019. But we believe it's really worth keeping eyes on this site as opposed to just walking away. There's such potential there. Dave, I don't know if you want to hit this or Avian.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think you and I can kind of both talk about it. I mean, it kind of, as an overall, it seems a shame. I mean, we've got, 17 years worth of data, and I'm not saying we need to get back in there every year, but things are starting to really look pretty good. And there are certain things that, the encroachment of Russian olive, a little bit more salt cedar, that it wouldn't be bad to keep track of as well. Primarily to see if, the birds continue to stick around. We will most likely be surveying provided funding's available, which these days is still kind of up in the air as well, for both flycatchers and cuckoos. So we'll know if they show up. But again, kind of in the grand scheme, I mean, one of the goals of this restoration was to provide flycatcher habitat, and then kind of later on brought the cuckoo in. So yeah, continued monitoring, in terms of the bird community I'd love it. I mean, if a big old bag of cash fell out of the sky, I would keep doing it. There's Becky's part.
Hey, Dave, you're running close to time, just a heads up.
Yep. With regard to vegetation monitoring, some reasons to continue would be that this study is very unique. We have a comprehensive data. A very long time period, 17 years. The continued monitoring and the monitoring that's already happened provides a good reference for looking at trends and used for Reclamation's Bosque dell'Apache River realignment project. they're using height measurements to correlate with their mitigation that they plan to do down there. An important thing to monitor for is to track the spread of Russian olive and Siberian elm. I know there's a cost is involved, and funding is always a problem, but really the expensive treatment is low compared to all the resources that we spent on restoring this site to a desirable and functional ecosystem. Regardless of if we continue monitoring, we do recommend that the site be treated, that Russian olive be controlled.
Okay. Becky, do you have something to say regarding this slide?
Oh, I just wanted to say this has been a really interesting study. I feel pretty fortunate to have been involved. I started in 2003. Dave came on a little bit later. The co-workers, though, who were involved in this project early on in the planning and design phases back in 2000, 2001, have retired. So we have very little in-house knowledge of the full history of the site. I know there's people out there who do have better knowledge of the very beginnings. So pipe up if you've got something to say about that.
Right.
I'm not aware of management that has gone on in the site, honestly. So that's something else if anybody has any insight on that. But yeah, it's been really great to see this turn into a successful site and see drastic changes over time. So
I agree.
yeah, Mickey, I see you say you haven't retired. You're the one person I'm thinking of actually.
Right. Right. So, and speaking of Mickey, I know, considering technical difficulties and, some chatting, I don't know, Debbie, how much time do we have to show some video clips?